I am Carla Pratt-Keys. I'm the pastor of Ginter Park Presbyterian Church, just a block that way. And I worked along with folks here at the seminary to bring our co-moderator, Denise Anderson, here tonight. And I'm just so very pleased to see you and glad that you could be with us and glad that folks could be with us remotely as well. And as we begin tonight, let us spend a moment praying. Let us pray. God, who calls us into being and who calls us into doing, we praise you for your work within us and around us, for your Spirit challenging, comforting, and changing us. We pray that this time we share tonight, this conversation we'll share, will also challenge, comfort, and change us in ways that make you glad. We pray in the Spirit of Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So it is a big pleasure to welcome Denise Anderson here tonight. As you probably know, she and Jan Edmiston are our co-moderators of the Presbyterian Church USA, our first ever co-moderators, as it happens. They were elected co-moderators at a significant anniversary. I just learned this recently. It was 60 years after women became eligible to serve as pastors in the Presbyterian Church USA, and 85 years after the first woman was ordained a ruling elder. So significant signs of God's Spirit opening the church to new ways of perceiving one another and new ways of doing things. Denise is also the youngest person ever elected to be moderator or vice moderator in the Presbyterian Church USA. And having gotten to know her a little bit over the last few years, I can't say I'm surprised. She is a woman of extraordinary insight and courage. Jan saw that, and the commissioners to the 222nd General Assembly saw that. I'm especially pleased to welcome Denise here because she is no stranger to Richmond. Denise is a graduate of VCU. She lived and studied here before continuing her studies at Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. Denise has served the church in a whole host of ways. She was on National Capital Presbytery's Committee on Representation and on its Leadership Council. She's worked as a vital signs interpretation consultant and also on the Next Church strategy team. She has worked in at least 2 different congregations, the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church of Washington and Unity Presbyterian Church in Temple Hills, Maryland, where she is currently pastor. She's also a writer. In addition to preaching regularly, she writes her own blog called Sola Scriptura, to be young, gifted, and reformed. And she contributed to the book called There's a Woman in the Pulpit. Christian clergy women share their hard days, holy moments, and the healing power of humor. So it's through Next Church that I've gotten to know Denise, and I've witnessed what she promised before her election as co-moderator. She promised to show respect and compassion every day, every week of her term. Listening is more than waiting to talk, she said. And I've seen that in her. The willingness to listen deeply, with respect, with compassion. And then when she does open her mouth to talk, you know that what she says is going to be carefully formed, wise and brave and inspiring.
Usually.
So thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Carla. We do have, I don't know how many, but we may have some folks connecting with us from a distance through streaming. We welcome you. We welcome all of you who are here this evening, especially welcome the Reverend Anderson. Is it all right if I call you Denise?
Please do.
That'll be shorter.
Yes.
And you can call me John. I'm John Carroll. I teach New Testament here. And I was telling Denise before we met, my father was a 45 5-year minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, was the runner-up for moderator one year. So you did better. You did better. He didn't think about the co-moderator thing. Well, there are a number of questions that have been. I'm standing in for Michelle Freeman Owens, who had a last-minute conflict and couldn't be here. So she did receive a lot of questions from folks, some really wonderful questions. We may have, in addition, some questions that come from listeners out there in various locations. But she's organized questions in a helpful way. Some first about Denise's experience being co-moderator, and then moving some questions about the Presbyterian Church, and then moving more broadly to the big uppercase of the whole church. So we hope these questions and Denise's wisdom and response will be helpful. We hope if these trigger some more questions and thoughts, that there'll be space and opportunity for that as well. So Denise, really happy you're here and appreciate your willingness to enter into dialogue with our community. So there's a personal question. Did you grow up in the Presbyterian Church USA? And whatever you answer to that, what is it about the Presbyterian Church that you have found a source of blessing? Maybe what's something that's been frustrating or troubling?
Well, to the first question, no, I did not grow up in the Presbyterian Church USA. Something to know about me is that I'm a military brat. Yeah. Both of my parents served in the United States Air Force. And we were not a particularly churchy family at all. I was baptized as a baby. I was born in England, and we had come back, well, for them, back for me for the first time to the States to visit family in my mother's hometown of Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And during that visit, my great great-aunt, insisted that I be baptized with no church connection. Don't have a conniption, Presbyterians. But she insisted that while they were in the States, they were going to have me baptized. I was baptized at Bethel AME Church in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Still didn't go to church. Whatever sporadic attendance we had at church was for weddings, funerals, or the occasional attendance at base chapels. But my parents were among the dones, okay? My mother was, she was churched when she grew up. She grew up in the AME and the holiness traditions. So they would go to Sunday school at one church and then run over and sing in the choir at another church. She believed that she had served her time. Amen. So we just weren't very churchy. And so when I became a teenager, when I was in high school, I started to have some questions about faith and starting to feel this pull back into the fold, I guess, and started going to my friend's Baptist church in high school. And I got to VCU, and as the Baptists say, backslid. Had a lot of fun doing it too. But then left VCU, escaped, graduated, whatever you want to call it, and moved up to the DC area to find work. There was a lot of work for graphic designers. I'd studied graphic design. I was one of those weird art kids you see around campus. And started to feel that pull again, you know? And I found my way back into the AME tradition. Was a member of an AME church that some friends from back home who were living in DC at the time went to. And it was at that church, while worshiping in and serving in that church, that I felt this tug toward ministry. But I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't really feel that I was being called to ministry in that particular tradition. So I enrolled at Howard School of Divinity as a means of exploring this call and what that meant. Now, that is a very expensive way to do that. It's not something it's not something that I would, encourage, but, God is weird. And so God moves us in very strange and unexpected and surprising directions. I attended Howard and was taught by some amazing instructors, many of whom were Presbyterian. And I was also dating a guy at the time who was going to Prince George's Community Presbyterian Church. And he decided that halfway through my first year, he was going to propose. So after he proposed, I joined his church and was immediately put to work. So when Presbyterians talk about the priesthood of all believers, they mean it. They definitely mean it. But it was at Howard that I was able to marry these interests of social justice and public engagement with my faith in a way that I had never really heard articulated before. And that experience at Howard forever shaped my ministry. And I still wasn't rushing toward ordination. I walked across that stage, belly full of daughter, who was 9 years old at this time. And it was about a year and a half after that that I finally enrolled as an inquirer and stopped running. I ran, even having an MDiv, I ran from my call. And I just appreciate so much that it's in the Presbyterian Church that I've been able to love the Lord, not just with my heart, not just with my soul, not just with my strength, but also with my mind. And I'm also one of those weirdos who really likes Presbyterian meetings. It's very strange. It is incredibly weird. But you know what? You know why I like Presbyterian meetings. I would go even when I didn't have to, which again is just strange. But it was at Presbyterian meetings that I would see people just go at it and just be in complete conflict with each other over various positions, particularly around General Assembly time when we're arguing overtures and whether or not we're going to concur with someone else's overture or what have you. And then everyone would gather around the table and take communion. It was the first time for me, being in the PCUSA, that I saw God at work in conflict. And conflict or difference of opinion or difference of position did not negate our unity in Christ. And I have never seen that anywhere. I had been in faith traditions that were conflict averse. If there was any knockdown, drag out like that, it meant that God was not in it. But I felt God in it. And I couldn't deny God's presence in it. And so for me, especially, okay, newsflash, I'm black, and the PCUSA is 91% white. For me, it really helped me live into this reality of being in communion with people who were not like me and I was not like them. We might have profoundly disagreed on many things, and yet we could all gather around the table. And I think that for me has been the most treasured lesson, experience within the PCUSA. What frustrates me is that we are often in our heads, perhaps a little bit too much. And I don't know if you've noticed, but we Presbyterians can be very pedantic sometimes. And I would like for us to remember that baptism and that common table a little bit more than we tend to do. Thankfully, I've gotten to see this church in ways that I never would have if not serving in this position. And I see that gathering around the table and that remembrance of our baptismal covenant. And it renews my faith in our tradition that we can get this right if we bring our whole selves to it.
Thank you, Denise. That's wonderful. I'm thinking 1 Corinthians and Acts and all sorts of things as you're talking, but, you know, I don't want to steal your time. Now, some questions about your experience as co-moderator. You've been at it for quite a while, been putting a lot of miles on your frequent flyer, I'm sure, accounts. So there's a specific question about trips you made to Rwanda and Thailand. And so the question is, what surprised or impressed you in those trips? And then a broader question from it, what is the Presbyterian Church doing globally that we all should know about? How is our engagement in world mission changing?
So first, a word about Thailand. At our past General Assembly, we adopted an anti-human trafficking policy. And Thailand was a trip solely focused on anti-human trafficking efforts in that part of the world. And so we took the trip. It became a moderatorial delegation after I joined on. But it was with Ryan Smith at the Presbyterian Ministry at the United Nations. It was with one of our mission co-workers in the Philippines, whose work is human trafficking in Southeast Asia. It was with the peacemaking program with the Presbyterian Mission Agency, and we were hosted by our two mission co-workers in Bangkok. And so we spent about a week and a half traveling throughout Thailand, speaking with the United Nations, with the ILO, with the European Union, with the United States Embassy, speaking with NGOs that work with indigenous populations in the northern part of the country, in the hill tribes, working on documentation for indigenous peoples who live in very remote areas. If you cannot get to a hospital when it's time for you to have a child, in all likelihood, you will not be documented. There will be no official recording of your birth. If you're not documented, then you don't exist, as far as the government is concerned. If you don't exist, you can't work, you can't go to school, you have no rights, essentially. And so there are a number of NGOs that work toward getting indigenous populations in Thailand documented. And specific to the reasoning for our trip, if you're not documented, that makes you all the more susceptible to being trafficked. We met with ECPAT and the Code, who work with the hospitality industry to combat child sexual exploitation. We visited a Pakistani family in an immigrant detention center, and that was all on election day. It was a very difficult day. Just knowing that, just seeing some of these conditions that human beings are living in and not really even being able to speak directly to them, being separated by 6 feet of fence and having to yell across those fences to these people who were visiting. That was a very heavy trip. But you need to know that your mission co-workers are part of large-scale international efforts to ensure that migrant workers aren't exploited, to ensure that children are not exploited, to ensure that indigenous populations the world over are not exploited. I was so angry at what I was seeing, particularly knowing that it's happening here on these shores too, and has been for a long time. It doesn't matter who the president is. But very encouraged that we've got folks on the ground who are fighting it face to face and doing some amazingly difficult but faithful work in ensuring that human beings are treated as such. I mean, it was also a heavy visit because that was also during the mourning period for King Bhumibol. They had recently lost their king, and it was an entirely difficult experience for everyone in the country at the time. You felt that heaviness. But I left with a little bit of encouragement that someone is faithfully entering into that context. And when I went to Rwanda, it was to be with mission co-workers on the continent of Africa. Every 3 years, our mission co-workers on the continent have a gathering somewhere on the continent. This time they chose Rwanda. This was during the 23rd anniversary commemoration of the genocide in Rwanda. So you talk about heaviness once again. So mission co-workers in Africa, including Rwanda, gathered for a week of learning from our partners, the EPR, the Presbyterian Church in Rwanda, on the reconciliation efforts some 2 decades after the genocide. And in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the genocide, you have some serious work being done by seminaries on crafting theologies around reconciliation and trying to make some theological and ethical sense of what was happening and how to prevent it from happening again. PCUSA mission co-workers are a part of that work. They teach at PUR, the Protestant University of Rwanda, and we learn from our mission partners in Rwanda about what they're doing to help heal their country. And this is just 23 years after the genocide. They facilitate a ministry called the Light Group. The Light Group is an intentional fellowship between Tutsi who had lost their entire families in the genocide and Hutu perpetrators, some of whom had served time for their crimes. And these are folks who have gathered together to be church. Amidst the hurts, it still hurts, and they'll be very honest about that. But just seeing the very, not just nebulous and intellectualizing of what happened, but the real, on the ground, heart-to-heart, face-to-face, person-to-person work of reconciliation that I frankly only attribute to the work of the Holy Spirit. That was transformational, because 23 years, these wounds are still fresh. There are people who have personal memory of what happened. And so if they can enter into this work bravely, even to the point of confessing the church's complicity in what happened, surely we can. So that made me a little braver to tell some difficult truths when I came home. And also what was cool about it was that my family got to accompany me on that trip, which they don't often get to do. And so I think it was transformational for my entire household.
I think from the outside, it seems that there's a shrinking of resources for mission in the wider world. What do you, as you think about what's possible for the Presbyterian Church USA and its global reach, what do you think is most important for us to be engaged in, and what hope do you have that we can make a difference?
I have immense hope that we can make a difference because I see that we are. It's hard to identify what we need to be most engaged in. I think particularly when it pertains to our mission co-workers and the work of World Mission, they are right on target. They are participating in the work of not only humanizing folks whose humanity has been neglected, but speaking truth to power in respectful ways, walking alongside. And this is what I love about the World Mission model as it exists today, is that it is not coming into some place with the gospel of Jesus Christ as if we have all of the answers. It's working alongside what God is already doing where they're dispatched to go. And it's that posture that allows you to be taught, right? And then when you're taught, you come home and teach. A lot of the folks that I've been blessed to meet and visit with are either wrapping up their interpretive assignment or they've just wrapped it up and returned back to the mission field. Interpretive assignment is when they come home to the US and they have an entire tour where they go and they share their learnings and elicit support and connect the work that they're doing wherever they are deployed to their home churches or their home denomination. Our mission co-workers have their hand in a little bit of everything: reforestation, public health, refugee resettlement, human trafficking. There's nothing that they're not doing all around the world. So it's hard for me to say what is most important for us to focus on. It's all so important, and I'm so glad that we have such a diverse representation out there doing the work that needs to be done.
Good. Thank you. I think the turn now would be to questions more generally about the Presbyterian Church USA. And here's one about the big tent in St. Louis last summer that brought together the Poor People's Campaign and work against racism. Knowing what you do of Richmond and the issues that we face here, what would your wisdom be for us with regard to these kinds of concerns?
What's the answer?
Right. What is the answer?
This the time at VCU had to pay off.
Listen, Richmond, in many regards, is like a lot of cities. You've got the displacement of the poor in the name of development. You've got, this is the former capital of the Confederacy. Those ghosts are still here, right? And with Charlottesville specifically, and then the subsequent demonstrations in response to that. I haven't been down Monument Avenue in years. And given what's been going on in our country right now, I think it would be particularly difficult to drive down Monument Avenue. I think that we need to tell some difficult truths about our history relative to this city and this nation. When I was living in Richmond, what struck me, and I don't know what it's like now, but what struck me was just the deep divide between the haves and the have-nots, as it were. And it was so stark, it could be delineated by a river. I lived on the south side for a while. And my experience on the south side was markedly different from my experience in the north side, off Parham Road, like right within Henrico County. What theologies are being taught and developed within these walls that help us give some frameworks for building equity in a city like this, where the systems are so deeply entrenched and the ghosts so incredibly active? People here still go to church, yay. So then what are they hearing in their churches from us? What are we prepared while we're here to teach folks about what these realities say about us and our culture and the things that we hold dear? And what are we prepared to offer a world that is so deeply invested in these systems in exchange? I don't know what y'all need to do. I hate to say it, but I left Richmond so fast as soon as I got my degree. And that's back when Richmond, listen, I could live in Richmond now. It's a lot about it has changed, a lot about me has changed, more importantly. But I left it so fast. What if I had stuck around and invested in it? I don't know. I wish I had an answer. I really do. But specifically about our hopes for the New Poor People's Campaign, Jan and I were elected on the 1-year anniversary of the massacre in Charleston. That has always been, for us, an impactful time. And I don't know if you know this, Jan is white. So in our respective social locations, there's no way that we could lead this denomination and not have something to say about where we go in the witness of anti-racism. What is the PCUSA's role in dismantling racism? At our last General Assembly, we adopted our anti-racism policy. We took steps to refute the doctrine of discovery and made apology to Native American communities for the role that we played in the erasure of much of First Nations culture. Jan had met the author of this book called Waking Up White, which is a personal memoir of a white woman who comes to the realization of racial realities in America. She said, you know, if I had my way, everyone in this denomination would read that book. And so we commended it to reading. And when we would travel and people would tell us that they were engaging with this work as a church or small groups or however they were reading it, they invariably would ask, well, why now? What do we do now? What do we do now? What's next? And so at our General Assembly, we adopted an overture from the Presbyterian of Cascades, which is Oregon, Western Oregon, on committing ourselves to the gospel of Matthew 25. And it was an overture that called the PCUSA to realigning ourselves alongside the poor and to be led by the poor in eradicating poverty in the United States. At the same time as General Assembly, there was this growing grassroots call to revive the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign ahead of the 50th anniversary, which is just next year. These things were happening at the same time. Liz Theo-Harris, who is out of Union, who is a PCUSA minister, has dedicated her entire academic scholarship and her entire life's activism to work alongside the poor, and she put out this book called Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. We introduced this work to the PCUSA with Liz present at Big Tent this past summer. And we asked people to engage with this work, to read it in the same way that they were reading Waking Up White, to undergird themselves with a theology that challenges how we have approached anti-poverty work as a church and how we have theologized poverty. And her work is illuminates how Jesus critiques his own followers in the ways in which they engage the poor. They criticize the sinner woman who anointed Jesus' feet with oil and said she could have sold all that ointment and given the money to the poor. He said, the poor you're always going to have with you. Not because poverty is just an intractable reality, but because you are not honoring your commitments under the law to forgive debts, to take care of the economically vulnerable, the widow, the orphan. If you do these things, then poverty will not exist. But since you don't, the poor will always be with you. So that was an invitation that we extended. I extended anew to folks at Union, to folks in the Presbytery of the James, because that work is so necessary here in Richmond. It seems that not much has changed since I left. At least not enough has changed. A lot has changed, and yet not enough. So I commend that to all of us to enter into this work or continue this work together.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to the question about race. You mentioned the 91%. We might be able to speak and act with more power with regard to deeply entrenched racism in our society and our culture if we were a more diverse church. Do you have thoughts about how that might happen, or how we might move toward a more diverse church reality?
There is not much that we need to do to be more diverse because we are becoming more diverse. It's happening. Just to put it in perspective, somewhere around 1981, the locus of world Christianity ceased to be in Europe or North America, the West, and was located in the global South. Africa currently contains 1/4 of the world's Christian population. Most of the growth that the PCUSA is seeing in terms of our new worshiping communities and newly chartered churches are not mostly white. Most of our fast-growing churches and new churches come from immigrant communities. I'm in National Capital Presbytery. Silver Spring Presbyterian Church is one of the fastest growing and continues to be one of the fastest growing churches in our communion. Most of the folks there are from Cameroon, Nigeria, Ghana, other parts of West Africa. We are becoming diverse. The question then is about structural power. Are those of us who are used to the PCUSA looking a certain way, feeling a certain way, are we open to it being radically changed by this shift in Christendom? And not just world Christendom, but American Christendom. Are we willing to share power and wherever necessary, get out of the way, step back and be taught? I think for many of us, we are used to being the hosts and telling people, come in and join with us, join with what we're doing. Are we now willing to be the guests and accept how that feels? It initially feels a little bit like displacement for many people. I acknowledge that. However, are we willing to be the guests and to embrace someone else's custom, take off our shoes when we go into their house? You know what I mean? Are we willing to not be centered or find ourselves sharing the center?
Yeah, my understanding is that the transformations happening in mission are really right around these kinds of things. Decentering or reversing the direction that, as you've said before, God is there ahead of us, right? And to being open to what's happening there. Here's a question from a chaplain, hospital chaplain. Are we making moves as a denomination to include more out-of-the-box ministries as validated positions? Do you see the church dreaming bigger dreams to be flexible outside of the four-walled parish?
I do. The beautiful part of this role is that I get to travel around the country and see this denomination in ways that I never would otherwise. I am seeing presbyteries be increasingly creative in the ministries that they're validating their minister members to. I think specifically of Renee Roederer in Detroit Presbytery, who was fairly recently validated to a ministry to nuns and duns. Mm-hmm. So it's a specific kind of chaplaincy that doesn't happen in a hospital or a clinical setting, but it's a community chaplaincy. And seeing folks validated to like community farms, to skateboard ministries, just to all kinds of unique ministerial settings. And that's not to say that we are wide open with that. We could certainly be more open, and I think we're going to have to do more of that and encourage our mid-councils to, wherever possible, work with someone who has a radical idea that's just out of the box and probably doesn't involve wearing a Geneva gown on Sunday mornings.
And kind of get in the way of the skateboard.
Right. You trip, right? But there's some work to be done there, but I'm seeing it. And if it's happening on the current scale, it can grow. It can only grow, which I hope it does.
So a question, picking up in the Mid-Council Leader Conference just this week, a report was issued that said seminarians, by and large, come from churches that don't reflect the churches they'll likely be called to serve. For example, coming from big churches likely to go to smaller congregations. Any thoughts about how we might address this systemically?
Right. What was so fascinating to come out of that gathering was the numbers, and I wish I had the charts with me, but that showed that most of our inquirers and candidates are coming out of churches that have hundreds of members, hundreds and hundreds of members. Now, they're not going to be called, more than likely, to churches that are like that. And so the question was raised about cross-cultural ministry. And cross-cultural ministry, not just looking at different ethnicities doing church together, but small churches have a distinctly different culture than a larger church. And so then how can we use this time in seminary to prepare someone who is coming up through the ranks, so to speak? That's very hierarchical language, forgive me. Prepare for a context that they are in all likelihood going to be called to first. The important observation was that everyone needs to have some experience, perhaps an internship or a residency in a church that is substantively different in size from the churches in which they were raised and came up in. So if you came up in a small church, get some experience in a larger church. If you came up in a larger church, maybe take an internship in a smaller church. Maybe mid-councils can offset the costs and provide the stipends, whereas the church where they would be interning might not be able to afford them. There are creative things that we could do to help our seminarians get a broader understanding of what kinds of churches and cultures they will encounter once they get out there and finish with the process and become certified and receive their first call. It was a fascinating and eye-opening, and it was my experience. You know, I came from a home church of a couple hundred members or so in worship, and I was first called to a church of 25. I had to learn a lot about the culture of that church. It just was not going to work the way that things worked in my home church.
Right out of seminary, I could take a church of 200 and make it one of 25. You know,
there's that too.
That's another story. But thinking about revitalizing congregations, revitalizing churches. So, there's a question, the 1001 NWC initiative, which I guess is New Worshiping Communities.
Yeah.
Good. We're wonderful at acronyms.
Yes. It's another thing I love, hate about us.
So can we as a denomination do something like that kind of initiative to help strengthen, resource, revitalize, small churches, stressed churches?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because a lot of the NWCs we see are either underwritten, hosted, or somehow supported by an existing church. Sometimes we see existing churches that perhaps are at the end of their life sort of entering into this 1001 process as a means not just of revitalization, but of new life entirely. Thankfully, there are some mid-councils that have we had to discontinue the new beginnings on a wide scale, but there are some mid-councils that continue that program for churches that are reassessing their health and vitality as a church. I really like what my presbytery is doing. They have this program called A New Thing, and it's very new. It's a very new thing. They've taken a church that dissolved recently, and out of that space and within that community, created something entirely new. And so now they're looking at that model for churches like my little 25-member church, who are considering dissolution, but still want to have some missional impact in the community. They just can't do it in their current form because all of their resources are going to support a building. Well, then how can we then assume responsibility for that building, allow the church to just be a church, so that all of their resources, all of their energy don't go to maintaining things as they were, but perhaps can go to forming something that could be, and doing that with the support of their mid-council or their synod, or even GA funds that float around and churches take advantage of. I am, and is the case with our polity. Everything happens from the congregation out, right? We don't have a papacy. This ain't Rome, where whatever Louisville says, that goes, and then it just filters out. Everything starts with our congregations, and I'm seeing more local bodies, mid-councils being responsive to the context of congregations. And then that impacts General Assembly policy. And then I've seen something that we have tried in National Capital have impact in Milwaukee, and they end up doing the same thing. Or, any number of things like that. That for me is where the connectionalism comes in. Like, okay, what are you doing? How's that working for you? Can we try that in our mid-council? You think that would work? Just tell us how you did it. Okay, I think we could do that. So I'm seeing things happen, and I think eventually the more innovative things that our mid-councils are doing will catch on to the entire assembly.
Yeah, it does seem to me, as a connectional church, creatively connectional, we don't think so much about established structures, but think about an innovative missional response.
Right.
And if some people over here have figured out how to do that, people here, and here, who could learn about it,
right.
It could really strengthen mission more broadly. So I really like that.
And if I can plug Next Church, which, there you go, thank you, Linda. One of the reasons I got involved with Next Church, right, is because that's all that we did, was share stories about what was working for us, and helping each other figure out, could that work in my context? And usually that's more of a congregation to congregation thing, or a minister to minister thing, but it's having more impact on a larger scale. It's having an impact among mid-councils. That for me, just being in that kind of space where we were constantly sharing ideas, was just transformational for my ministry. I must shout out Next Church.
This leads me to another question, and the reason I'm thinking this is the importance of that connection to other ministerial colleagues, other folks who are figuring out how to do this with the challenges we have. The question is from a young enough minister who is looking at a career of having to be in transitional ministry. This person says, I think I'll be like Moses, lead the people through the wilderness, get to the brink of the promised land, or the future church, the next church, but never get to see it. What wisdom do you have for persons like me? Now, that's a tough question.
It's sort of like what Jan and I are doing, because we've only got 2 years to do this, right? And so we have to think about what our impact is. After those 2 years are up, a new moderator comes in, a new assembly happens, and then we're just chopped liver, right? But we were talking a lot about planting at the mid-council gathering. There was this beautiful liturgy around seeds. I don't know if you were there for that, Ken. And You know, it reminds me of that biblical illustration of one planting, another watering, everyone coming along to have their you know, the way that the sower just carelessly disseminates the seed. Doesn't matter what kind of ground it looks like, rocky, thorny path or good soil. They just plant and trust God for the harvest, for the increase. I would think that with transitional ministry, and all ministry is transitional, right? Because prayerfully and hopefully it will transcend you and go past you. All ministry being transitional, it's imperative then that we trust God to do whatever God will do with the role that we are playing. And the way in which we sow our seed. If we trust God for the harvest, and I think that's with all ministry, we might have a better time. I think that's probably the most wisdom I could give to someone who is called to transitional ministry. It's a blessed calling.
Success metrics need to be redrawn, don't they? Well, somebody said, ask her a Reformation question. Well, we've got this 500th anniversary, right? As you think about the significance of the Reformation, think about our church today, what ought we to say? What ought we to celebrate? What ought we to do?
I talk a lot about Phyllis Tickle where I go. What she talks about in her book, The Great Emergence, about the every 500 years rummage sale that the church goes through. She calls it a rummage sale. You know, you've got Constantine's conversion to Christianity, and then you've got the Great Schism, the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Church, and then you've got the Protestant Reformation. My daughter goes to a Lutheran school, and she came home with a flat Luther yesterday. I considered sending her home with a flat Calvin, but now we are 500 years after that, and we are in the midst of another Reformation. We are yet discerning what that Reformation is. But as I said, almost 40 years ago now, the locus of world Christianity shifted. So then perspectives that are emerging out of Christendom are necessarily shifting, and perspectives that are having dominance in world Christendom are shifting. You've got everyone loves to lament about the changing religious landscape in the United States and how people are decreasingly churched. Okay, but what opportunities does that now present to us? Does it present any opportunities to us? I'm pretty sure that in Calvin and Zwingli's homeland, it might have seemed that all hell was breaking loose. During that Reformation, during the 500 years before that, during the 500 years before that. I get the sense that, at least in our context, the church is being displaced from prominence in American culture and being placed out of favor, which is scary within American culture. There used to be a time where all you had to do was just build a church and then people spilled into it. Not so anymore. And so a Christian community is now going to have to find ways to articulate why it's Christian. And maybe that's the opportunity that this Reformation affords us. It forces us to sit with our faith in some really significant ways and just not offer platitudes anymore, right? Not just accept certain things as they are and really wrestle with our faith. and communicate that wrestling and invite folks to wrestle alongside of us and be in community with us. But I think this Reformation is calling us to be more authentic and relational. At least that's what I hope.
So it seems that in our society now, much as in other eras, as you've talked about, Christian identity and vocation and mission are very much in contest. And so on the one hand, Presbyterians with our shrinking numbers, as we face the daunting challenges in our society and our culture, what kinds of ecumenical collaborations and partnerships make sense, but at the same time, what is still distinctive about a Presbyterian identity and commitment, right, that we need to uphold and contribute to that wider ecumenical discussion? It's an inchoate kind of question, but I think as we look at other ways in which the name Christian is advanced in our culture, it's really important to have, with integrity and clarity and focus and sharpness, a representation of the Christian faith and practice that has integrity for us.
Right, and we as leaders are going to have to help the people who are in our charge, in our care, be able to articulate their faith for themselves too.
Part of it, you mentioned the priesthood of all believers,
Right.
so the empowerment of the people to do this. It's not just a clerical class that's going to do this.
Right.
Yeah. But I think there are really important issues and questions there. We're at about 8:05. There are a few more questions here if we need them, but I wonder if you're open to having folks here gathered the opportunity to raise some questions or share some comments. We can provide the space for that. And I'll check Mike to see if anybody is from a distance out there interested in asking a question. So do you all have some things you'd like to join in the conversation? Katie? And for Denise's benefit, go ahead and tell who you are.
It just started. It doesn't count yet.
Second year. You talk about more authenticity in a relational church. What are some practical steps that we can take to start thinking about it?
So the question was, Denise had talked about authenticity in a more relational church. What are some concrete ways and steps to do that?
So relationship is built among human beings, you and I sitting here and talking. I can't believe I'm about to shout out Next Church again. Next Church being a relational network of church leaders and all of us are leaders basically, draws a lot of its methodology from community organizing, specifically the Industrial Areas Foundation model, which for me was deeply impactful to my ministry. And all that is building public relationships so that we might be able to discern what concerns us collectively, what kinds of things could we build some power around. I think some practical steps maybe even come from that model of intentional one-on-one communication with people and developing deep relationships, whether they're personal or public. If you're doing community organizing, they're public relationships, right? So you're not looking to be their kid's babysitter or anything like that, but you are looking at what the concerns are, where the cold anger lies, where the passions lie. Listening to stories, animating stories, like what are the things that just impacted your folks? That to me is probably the most important way in which we will build truly relational ministry and community is by taking a genuine interest in what makes each other tick. And that especially needs to happen with people with whom we don't agree, or people who we are content to stereotype or pigeonhole. I think then we need to be even more intentional in developing those relationships and clearing the slate of our minds as to what we might believe about that person and really seeing them for who they are. That might even sound nebulous. I hope it didn't sound nebulous, but I think that's what we need to do at every turn, wherever possible, is build those public relationships.
Others?
That sounds kind of like love.
You know, what a concept. Love.
Wish they'd thought about that when they were writing the
Right.
Bible.
Someone should have put something in there about that. Not all at once.
What is it? Is there another? Yeah, Alex, go.
Alex Fisher, my final level in New Sweden. I strongly identify with what you said about being at General Assembly and, you know, you're amidst the arguments and the debates and the fights, but we all are unified at the table of Jesus. And I love that imagery. I think it's so important for the future of the church, especially considering the state that our country is in right now. And in what you just said about, you know, loving those especially whom we disagree with. I'm just curious the ways you see that play out in our denominations, the way you see that hope, if you see that hope in our time.
I do. I have lost track at this point of how many presbyteries I've visited. I've gotten to, listen, I have enough Presbyterian meetings under my belt for a lifetime, and I still like them. And almost everywhere I've been, I've seen that very thing that I told you attracted me to Presbyterian meetings in the first place. And I'm seeing congregations that probably don't have a ton in common theologically or philosophically, collaborating on mission initiatives. Like, they see that there's a gun violence problem in their community, and they know that together they could make an impact in that. They know that together they could feed the food insecure within the community. I see partnerships that arise all over the country, all over the world, really. Our folks love to tout their missional engagement, and they might send a delegation to, I don't know, Guatemala, like every 3 years or so, but they're very committed to that work, very committed to funding it where they can. You know, we like to write a check, but also engaging in those relationships and ensuring that they're walking alongside what they have put their hand to supporting. I see it. Now, we could do better. We could do more, but I see it all the time. I was talking to, he just walked out anyway, John Vest.
He's going to start a new worshiping community.
Yeah, let him do that. But he
do
was,
the barbecue.
But he was telling me that it seems that with every moderator that he's met, they always come out of the term incredibly hopeful and optimistic. And a lot of that is because wherever you go to visit, they're always on their best behavior. So they show you the best. But when else would you hear about that? We are some complaining folks in the PCUSA. But I get to see the best, you know, because they don't want They don't want the moderator to go back and say, girl, let me tell you about them folks over there. They don't want that. So I get to see the best. And I get to share those stories in settings like this.
Someone else.
I'm Kelly. I'm a first year Emily student here, and you've shared so much insight to the future of the church and where you see the church going, and where we currently are and what we need to evolve into. And I'm wondering if anyone has approached you, or if you consider putting this into your own book and sharing that with the world, with that being such a popular text coming out for churches right now.
You wouldn't happen to work for Westminster John Knox Press, would you?
Kelly, for the sake of folks out there, Kelly observed that Denise has shared a lot of wisdom about the church and so on, and has she thought about maybe writing a book to capture this for a wider audience?
We have. It's just very hard to think about it while we are on this whirlwind, but we probably should while people still care. We have thought about that, and I have a few other ideas too that need to be fleshed out, but we have thought about that, especially given the novelty around, this is the first time we've ever had co-moderators, and that it's never been a possibility before now. So if you're wondering why no one ever did it before, that's why. It was after the 221st General Assembly that the standing rules changed and allowed for two people to co-equally share this role. And so just that by itself would be worth writing a book and chronicling how we navigated this new model and where we think the church should go, not just with this model, but period. But yeah, Westminster John Knox Press has asked about that as well. That's right.
Others? Yes. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. My girlfriend here, called and decided to work with me. But you've spoken a lot about the positive experiences that you've seen, how you've seen God and the conflict there. And just in conversations that I've had with Lindsay here, she's told me about a lot of the struggle the Presbyterian Church has had to face and how that has kind of changed it as you've seen people kind of choose, those divisions and run very deep, and people that kind of choose different paths to get to where they want to go. Is there a negative experience in that conflict? Because you talk about how God is in the conflict. Are there any, not too negative, but any negative experiences that you can share with us to kind of give us a better example of that? Because you've shown us kind of the very sunny, bright side. Like you said, everywhere you go, people are only the best. But has there been a time where you've kind of seen the worst, but still seen God?
So, great question. Denise has stressed the positive that she's experienced in the midst of conflict and God working in and through the conflict. But the question is, what about some of the negative? Is there something there, the struggle, the negative that she'd like to bring out?
Well, strife and conflict are taxing, right? They're just taxing. I think the grace that we have around that table serves to heal us, but ultimately it's healing us from our own doing, right? It's healing us in places where we have not been our best selves. That grace around that table is restorative. I go to mid councils, and that's what we call our presbyteries, our local collectives, where they are in the midst of very difficult dismissals to the point where there are lawyers involved and money involved, and all of that is incredibly taxing. And when you have to navigate something that hard, emotionally it's experienced quite, not at all unlike a divorce. But anytime you have to experience something that hard, it saps your imagination. It saps your energy. It saps your vision for doing mission. And it really takes your focus away from what kind of impact you could be having in the community. Those are the things that I lament that I see, because I do still see it, some places more than others. I still see that there are certain social groups within our denomination that have a hard time entering into a call. If you are a woman of color, if you are LGBTQ, if you are an immigrant with a non-American accent, that makes me sad, and those are the things that we try to call the denomination to account for and into a better way of being. But I see that too, it frustrates me, and those are the kinds of things that animate me, right? Animate us to continue doing this work, because as much beauty as we see and as much as we see God's grace abound, the work ain't done. And that's why we're here. So thank you for asking that. And I see folks like you. I get to hang out with seminarians who are on the cusp of their careers, and I wonder what space there will be for you, and as much as I can, with whatever power I have, I'm trying to help make that space. That would be my answer. Thank you.
We might have time for one more, but I wonder, well, you're getting the courage up to ask it or to say it. What didn't we ask we should have asked?
Can we give you a massage?
That class is not offered to spring term.
I would be remiss without thanking all of you. Brian, I'm not going to be too formal, to the Union Seminary family. I'm grateful for being here, and I understand that this was space made. My schedule was entirely nuts, and so I'm grateful to you for making this space. These are the more energizing visits that I get to do, when I get to be with students and those who are looking ahead to the future with hope and perhaps some trepidation too, and we all get to be community together. So thank you so much for this invitation.
You talk about wanting to create a space for them. This is just a small group of them, but we got fabulous students, and we need to do everything we can to tap their energy and
Not sap, but tap.
tap their energy and talent for
Yeah.
the strengthening of the church and its mission in the world. So thank you for everything you do to help make that happen. Brian, did you have a question, or do you want to?
I just wanted to ask one before we close. Do you have a word of advice or encouragement for people who are in seminary right now, who are students? I remember meeting a moderator when I was in seminary and hearing a voice of encouragement and kind of vision for it. And the world was very different in 1981 when I was coming out of seminary. But it was kind of neat to hear a moderator come and say, well, these are some words I have for those of you who are in seminary now. Do you have any kind of thoughts that might be helpful for them where we are in the church today?
If you're doing it right, you will use everything that you learned here. if you're doing ministry right, if you are really putting your all, you will use everything that you learn here. And I say that because I wondered why I was learning Greek and Hebrew sometimes, but the denomination told me I had to. So, but I can't say that there's not been a single thing that I haven't found useful, some clearly more than others. But you're going to be tasked with using what you learn here in ways that might even be foreign to the people who are teaching you. And everything that you learn here will be useful, but nothing that you learn in the class will ever be able to take the place of devotion, of spiritual formation, of of feeding your souls. And so, because you are stepping into a context that is foreign to a lot of us, you're going to have, I imagine, some incredibly discouraging moments, especially, you know, in those early days. It took me a while. It took me a little while between graduation and ordination. In order to hold on, I had to do something to feed my soul. And so you have to lean on the everlasting arms as it is. See, I'm going back to my Baptist roots. You have to lean on that when your faith gets tested, when your patience gets tested. You have to lean on that, lean on God. I mean, that's just advice I would give to anybody.
There is one question that came through from distance, and so to honor that, if we could conclude with that one. This person does not self-identify as a millennial, but maybe. But the question is about generations in the church. You know, however we define those, the distinctives of them, variability within each of the generations, but how you see the church now, Presbyterian Church, in terms of interaction across generational lines. What do you see? How are we doing? What might we be doing?
Oh, we need some work in that. And I say that because part of our job as moderators is to fill out committees, commissions, task forces, yeah, I think that's the plural. Various bodies that are either established by the General Assembly or that have always been in being, and it's the moderator's job to fill vacancies. I really want some age diversity on these bodies, and it's incredibly difficult to do because wherever there are young people, we are slow to engage them, slow to ordain them. I think that every church that sponsors an inquirer or a candidate needs to be prayerfully considering ordaining them as a ruling elder. I think every church that has really, really gifted high school students should consider and make space for ordaining them as elders and having them serve on session. And instilling the value in that. For as much as I think we do well, that's not one thing that I believe that we do well, because everywhere I go, I see a bunch of people who are like, ain't there nothing wrong with being my parents' age, but they're my parents' age. And that's pretty much it. So I don't get the sense that we have lived into our full potential in engaging folks who are out here working and viewing the world much differently than their predecessors. I think we have some work to do in that regard. And much of that work is being led by those it's just submitting to the leadership of those very people. That's what we need to do. Be taught by them.
Well, Denise, I don't know if you're able to individually field questions afterwards informally.
Absolutely.
So if you do have some, but let's, unless there's a motion to extend.
So Presbyterian.
That was for you because you love Presbyterian.
There will never be a motion to extend.
We will formally draw the program to a close. And Denise, thank you so much.
I was asked to say a word of prayer before we do conclude. I think we're going to spend some time with our students. Is that right? Individually, I think they're having some dessert time with the students here. So students, please know that back in EC 118, the room right behind. So she has some time for you individually. So we'll let you get to that. Let us, if we could, if
Just let me get dessert first.
That's right, there's dessert there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, let her do the important thing. There's no masseuse back there, unfortunately. If we're able, let us stand to be dismissed, those who are able. Gracious God, we are thankful for Denise's presence here with us and the wonderful work that she is doing throughout the church. We ask that you would bless our co-moderators as they continue to help us think of new ways of being church in this new time. And as we think about the many difficulties in the world around us, we are encouraged by her words of hope and possibility and vision, the things that she sees as she watches our churches in their best times, and even in their struggles and conflict, to see you moving in the midst. May we feel that movement continually here at the seminary, and may we continue as we go forth from this place to be agents of that movement, your movement in our world. We are thankful for her presence, we are thankful for her ministry, and we are thankful for her word to us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.